If you've ever been a new parent, you know that sound, that desperate, unending cry that makes you feel totally and completely helpless. And in that moment, you find yourself wishing that this tiny little human came with some kind of owner's manual. Well, today we're looking at two totally different ways to write that manual. One is all about practical, hands-on hacks, and the other is the super rigorous, data-driven world of science. Let's dive in. So, here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about the problem every single parent goes through. Then we'll check out a hacker's guide that's packed with real-world tips. After that, we'll see what happens when science goes head-to-head with one of the biggest reasons for crying, colic. We'll look at what the evidence actually says, and then we'll wrap it all up with a takeaway you can actually use. Okay, picture this. It's 3 in the morning. The house is silent, the whole world is asleep, but your world is a screaming mess. You've walked, you've rocked, you've shushed, you've fed them, burped them, changed them, and still, the crying just doesn't stop. It's that universal, sleep-deprived rite of passage for every new parent out there. And in those moments, this is the one question that just rings in your ears. I mean, you get a manual for your toaster, right? So why not for this incredibly complex, beautiful, and very, very loud little person? This question right here is really the launching point for our whole conversation today. This quote from Elena Furman just says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly captures that feeling of being totally and completely overwhelmed. She felt so lost that she decided she had to do something about it. And that brings us to our first potential solution. So, what happens when a parent who has been deep in the trenches decides to write the exact manual they wish they'd had from day one? Well, you get a hands-on, super practical guide full of what we might call baby hacks. And here it is, 101 Baby Hacks. This book is basically trying to be that cribside companion, a toolkit filled with natural, pretty simple solutions for everything from sleep meltdowns to gas and teething. It's a genuine attempt to create that missing owner's manual. And they really do try to cover the whole shebang. I mean, look at this list. There are hacks for sleep, feeding, gas, even teething and development. The goal here is pretty clear. Create one single, practical guide for just about every common issue a new parent is going to face. For instance, there's a hack for gas called the I love you massage. You gently trace those letters on your baby's tummy to kind of help get things moving. So what's the philosophy behind all these hacks? A lot of it really boils down to this quote from one of the experts who praised the book. The core idea is the simple power of touch, of massage, and physical connection. These aren't just a bunch of random tips. They're all built on the idea that a parent's own hands are probably the most powerful soothing tool they have. Okay, so we've seen this broad approach that's all about soothing and touch. But what about when the crying is just relentless? And it seems to have no cause at all. That's when you start hearing the word colic. And while the Hacks book gives you some general ideas, now we're going to pivot and see how hard science tackles this very specific, very intense problem. First things first, let's be super clear about what we mean by colic. Scientists have this guideline called the rule of threes. So this isn't just your standard baby fussiness. We're talking about intense crying for more than 3 hours a day, on more than 3 days a week, for over 3 weeks in an otherwise healthy baby. It's that specific, relentless pattern that researchers wanted to solve. So how do scientists actually find an answer they can trust? They do something called a systematic review. Instead of just doing one more experiment, they act like detectives. They gather up all the quality studies that have ever been done on a topic. They sift through thousands of papers, throwing out duplicates, low-quality research, anything that's not relevant, until only the most reliable, rock-solid evidence is left. It's really the ultimate way to cut through all the noise and conflicting advice. And that brings us to the moment of truth. After all that sifting and sorting through a mountain of research, what did the scientists actually find? Which of the common treatments for colic really hold up when you put them under the microscope? The review focused on 4 of the most common things parents and doctors try. You've got probiotics, the good bacteria. Then there's manual therapy, like osteopathy or chiropractic work. You have simethicone, which is in a lot of over-the-counter gas drops. And finally, proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs, which are prescription drugs meant to reduce acid. All right, so what actually worked? The first big winner was probiotics. The review found really strong evidence that for breastfed babies, a specific kind of probiotic could cut down the daily crying time by about 65 minutes. To a parent who is counting every single second, that is a massive, life-changing difference. Next up was manual therapy. This also showed a really powerful effect, reducing crying by up to 76 minutes a day. Now, it's important to mention that the scientists noted the studies for this weren't quite as top tier as the probiotic research, so it's a very promising result, but one they're just a little more cautious about. And this is why a review like this is so incredibly valuable. What didn't work? Well, the results for two super calming treatments were pretty surprising. Simethicone, yep, those popular gas drops, showed no significant benefit at all. And even more shocking, the prescription acid reducers, the PPIs, were actually found to be worse than doing nothing. Of course, effectiveness is only half the battle. You have to ask, is it safe? Well, the review found that the two things that actually worked, probiotics and manual therapy, also had a very low risk of any serious side effects. On the flip side, the PPIs were linked to an increased risk of serious problems like respiratory infections. Okay, phew. So we've got the hacker's manual full of practical tips on one side, and we've got the hard scientific data on the other. How in the world do we put these two things together into a toolkit that a real parent can actually use? So how do these two worlds actually fit together? Look, it's not about one being right and the other being wrong. Think of the Baby Hacks book as your general, all-purpose toolkit. It's for everyday soothing, for bonding. And then, think of the scientific review as your specialist, a high-powered diagnostic tool you bring in for a very specific and severe problem like colic. So here's really the key takeaway. The hacks, things like infant massage, focusing on touch, are fantastic for just promoting general comfort and strengthening that bond between you and your baby. That's your first line of defense. But if you're in the trenches dealing with the relentless challenge of diagnosed colic, the science points to very specific treatments, like certain probiotics for breastfed babies, as a proven way to actually reduce crying. And, the scientists behind the big review totally get that this is complex. They say their goal is to balance the hard evidence with a parent's choice. This isn't about finding one magic bullet that works for every baby. It's about giving parents the best possible information so they can make smart, informed decisions with their doctor. And that leads us to a final thought to leave you with. In a world that is just flooded with parenting blogs, advice from family, and endless late-night Google searches, we've seen today that clear, high-quality evidence is actually out there. So the real question becomes, why is it still so hard to find? And how can we all get better at telling the real science from all the noise?